Greetings and welcome to Chapter 17, Foreign Policy. So, this lecture, we're going to be looking at what is foreign policy, actors in foreign policy, how choices are made, approaches to foreign policy, tools within foreign policy, the importance of the international system, levels of analysis, a brief summary or a brief history of foreign policy issues, and we will conclude with a discussion on genocide. So we have a lot of ground to cover. So with that said, let's dive into this. So one of the things that is often talked about, especially when we start talking about foreign policy, is how much money we use and how much of our budget is actually geared towards foreign policy or foreign affairs. Because there's often this misconception that we spend a whole lot of our budget and that somehow we are neglecting home, or somehow we're neglecting the United States by spending as much as we do in foreign policy or in foreign affairs. So let's dive into this little discussion just very quickly. So if we take a look here at U.S. spending in 2021, if we take a look at our budget in the year 2021, note that the highest expenditure is income security with $1.6 trillion, right? Second is Social Security. Third, healthcare, national defense, Medicaid, etc., 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 until we get down to foreign affairs, which uses about $46.9 billion of our budget. Now, if we were to dive into that just a little bit deeper, we can tell here that it's used for international development and humanitarian assistance, just in general, foreign affairs, international security assistance, foreign information and exchange activities. So this is what our budget is used for in foreign policy, in foreign affairs. Yes, don't get me wrong. $46.9 billion is a lot of money. It is. In the grand scheme of things, comparatively speaking to the $1.6 trillion, it's really not that much in the grand scheme of things. So I like bringing this to our attention because, like I said, there's this misconception that we spend an ungodly amount. And in reality, it's not much, comparatively speaking. Now, like I said, I wish I had that kind of annual budget that I had. 40 was it? 40? No, not 49. It's $46.9 billion. Of course, I would love to have that, right? I have a lot of fun with that. But in the grand scheme of things, with our government, this is not a lot of money. So, and I like starting off with that quick introduction of how much of our budget's used. So let's dive into what is foreign policy. Yeah. So foreign policy, its definition: a government's goals in dealing with other countries or regions, and the strategy used to achieve them. Okay. So dealing with goals in dealing with other nations, right? This is the substantive question here. Now, what should we do, right? What should we do? How are we going to deal, or should I say, substantively, how are we going to deal with these other nations, right? And of course, the strategy is the how, right? So, what are we going to do, and how are we going to do it? This is, in essence, foreign policy, right? Other definitions include, right, the goals that a state's officials seek to attain broad and the values that give rise to those objectives and the means or instruments used to pursue them. Again, substantive and how, right? Other definitions include the approach and strategy government chooses to engage with other nations. Right? So we're looking at in foreign policy, right? What are we going to do, and how are we going to do it with other nations? The substantive, dealing with, the strategy, the how. This is foreign policy, okay? And of course, there are differences between domestic and foreign policy. Foreign policy often takes the back burner, right? That assertion is easily backed up. Take a look at any presidential debate, any. Foreign policy, it's usually left for the end of the debate, and it's like for the last 5-10 minutes, unless there is a very pressing foreign policy issue that is ongoing in that current time. Foreign policy is always pushed back. It's always pushed back to the back burner. We don't really hear much about it. And there's some reasoning for that. Long story short, to understand foreign policy and to understand how we should deal with other nations, we have to understand the history, the background, the culture, the issues of other nations. Because we can't, even though we might have one same problem in foreign policy. Let's take nuclear weapons, right? The proliferation of nuclear weapons in North Korea and Iran. Same issue in essence, but because of their cultures, because of their histories, because of their own background, because of their own governmental structures and how government operates is vastly different from the two. They can't be treated the same way, right? Because again, different backgrounds, different cultures, different forms of government. You see where I'm going with this? So it takes a lot of knowledge of other nations, really, for us to really fully grasp foreign policy. Now, this is the reason why when you speak about foreign policy experts, you'll often find they're experts in certain regions, or in certain regions, right? Or maybe specifically targeted states, meaning they have speciality in that particular states, in that particular nation or that particular state. So I'm digressing. We got a lot more ground to cover, so let's move on. So foreign policy asks these following questions. Should a nation act alone? What if there's a situation that is bad enough that it warrants our attention and it pulls on a heartstring? Should we act alone? Right? Should a nation build a coalition? If the issue is bad enough, should we try to get other people, other nations to join with us in this intervention of sorts, whatever the case may be, right? Now, of course, these two particular questions, right? Should we act alone? Should we act unilaterally? Right? That's what we're talking about. A nation acting alone. This is taking unilateral action. Building a coalition, this is acting multilaterally, meaning that you're building a coalition, you're getting other nations that maybe you're persuading them to agree with you, but you're getting them to support you, and you're building this coalition to address whatever this issue is that's facing, right? So that's acting unilaterally. You're getting other people, other nations, involved, right? What threats to protect against? This is a question that foreign policy asks, right? What costs to bear? And who should bear those costs? These are questions deep within foreign policy. Right? So, the goals and interest, right? Foreign policy goals, objectives, interest, right? We can boil it down to four major points, right? First is the protection, first and foremost, the protection of the U.S. and its citizens, right, against foreign threats, right? This is one of the reasons why we see defense spending so high. This is part of the enumerated part of the U.S. Congress. This is a power for which they have. So obviously we're going to see high spending now. And of course technology changes and we need to be on that cutting edge. The maintenance of access to key resources and markets, right? Goods, services that rely on transportation or rely on natural materials in order to make computer chips or access to computer chips or IC chips as are commonly known as, or transistors, or these components. Having access to these and having access to markets to sell these goods. This is within our goal or objective or our interest. Right? The preservation of a balance of power in the world. This is extremely critical here that sometimes we tend to overlook, it seems. For example, let's take Ukraine. Right? The situation that is involving in Ukraine deserves our attention for various reasons, but mostly because we are seeing, human suffering is never a good thing, okay? It's never a good thing. War is never a good thing. Even if it's just, going to war sucks, right? Just to be frank, it is. It does. Even though it's justified, and even though if we're dragged into it or we need to go to war and it's just, we should, but still, it stinks, right? Preserving a balance of power in the world is within our interest. I mean, think about it. Again, going back to Ukraine, what's happening involving, what's going on in Ukraine, what's happening to the region in Europe, and particularly the retaliation from Russia in terms of gasoline supply, in terms of gasoline prices, and with our response of cutting out buying Russian gas, right, and oil. These have consequences, right? But we are trying. The premise behind all this is to bring a balance of power to the world so that there is no destability. That's the key here. Destability, it threatens balance of power. It threatens our interest. So yes, what happens in Ukraine is important to us, not only for the human loss and for the suffering, but also for we need a balance in the international system, in this atmosphere for which we interact with one another. We need to have that. Otherwise, it's left to chaos or another actor or another state, another nation, to come in and take over. And I don't know if that's in our best interest. Right? And lastly, the protection of human rights and democracy. These are critical points. Now, for you and I, we may rearrange this a little bit differently. Like maybe the protection of the United States and its citizens should be first, but the protection of human rights and democracy should be second. Right? And we're going to talk about frameworks and how we should arrange certain issues. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But for right now, the protection of human rights, right? The idea that you have a right to life, you have a right to existence, you have the right to basic human needs, right? And if a state violates that, if a nation, real quick, if I say state in this lecture, I'm referring to another nation. I'm referring to a foreign power, another country, in other words. So the protection of human rights, if a state is willing to violate the basic needs of its people. Question, and this is a question I would love your input on. Right? I really would. If a state violates or threatens the basic needs of its people, a small portion of its people even, does it forfeit its own sovereignty? if you're a nation that refuses to uphold its basic human rights of any of its population, does it deserve to have its sovereignty respected? It's a question. It's a good question. Let's move on. So, how to make choices within foreign policy? Well, before we dive into that more, okay, we have to understand a couple of things here real quick. Choices and options always exist. Always exist. Let me say it one more time just in case I didn't say it clear. Choices and options always exist within foreign policy. Some are more desirable than others. Some are more effective than others. But there are always choices. There are always options. Ranging from, and I think I've already mentioned this once already in previous lecture, but this idea that, let's take the situation with, with Russia in Ukraine, right? Let's take that for example. It's an option, we can do nothing. Absolutely nothing. We can support Ukraine by giving it military equipment, by giving it foreign aid, by giving it humanitarian assistance. We can help Ukraine by rallying NATO nations and rallying them to Ukraine's aid. We can do that. We can use our podium, right? The president's podium, that bully pulpit, to advocate against Putin and Russia and to advocate for President Zelensky and Ukraine. Right? The point here that I'm trying to make is that these are options. Another option is we could nuke Russia, blow them off the face of the map. Now, some choices, right, for this particular situation is extreme, and we perhaps shouldn't do it. But do you get where I'm going with this? There are always options. There are always choices. Some are more valuable than others. But nevertheless, doing nothing, doing something, or going to the absolute extreme, these are all choices that we have, that we can make. Does that make sense? So all options are in fact available, but not all are valuable or even desirable, right? There is a conflict between what we want and what we should do. And how do we answer this question, right? Well, we look to public opinion as to what we want. I mean, seriously, just literally ask the people, the public, hey, what do we want? And what we should do, right? The answer to this question is found in the concepts of national interest. So, without any further delay, let's dive into national interest, because this is a critical, key component of foreign policy. So, definition of national interest, right? The fundamental goals and objectives of a state's foreign policy. Again, when I say state here, I'm referring to another country, another nation. Right? Well, I mean, that's clear as mud, isn't it? The fundamental goals and objectives of a state's foreign policy. That's so vague. Let's see if we can't do better. The national interest is greater than all foreign policy objectives. Okay, I mean, that makes sense. But what is it? Let's try again. Foreign policy is guided by the notion that each nation is limited in the pursuit of its interest only by the strength of its resources. Okay, so national interest, the amount of our interest, is guided by how many resources we have. Again, clear as mud. There's a struggle, and this is a struggle. Political scientists, we struggle with giving concrete meaning to national interest. Because after all, national interest, you and I will have differing views on what our national interest should be, based upon our experiences, based upon our ideologies, based upon education, based upon how we view the world. You will have differing interests for this nation than me. So let's dive into frameworks that we use to try to understand, to try to give more meaning to national interest. So framing concerns help to determine our primary goals, right? So political scientists, policy experts, foreign policy decision makers, we come up with a list, right, to try to give priority to issues, right, to try to help us understand what our interests are. So we create this list of 3, okay? We have an A list, a B list, and a C list. The A list lists threats that pose a direct and immediate challenge to U.S. survival. Now, I want to take a moment here real quick to talk about survival. Let's take it outside the context of foreign policy for a second. Okay, what do you and I, as human beings, what do we need to survive? We need air, you're right. We need shelter. We need food. We need water. That's it. Those are the 4 things that we have to have. Food, water, shelter, air. That's what we need. Do we need a cell phone? No. Do we need a computer? No. Do we need a tablet? Do we need the internet? Do we need gaming? Do we need any of this stuff? No. No. Is it good to have? Sure. Do we have to have it? No. Not for our survival. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about direct threats to our survival. Direct and immediate threats to our survival. So this is a special list, if you will. Right? Not everything is a threat to our survival. We're going to get into that in just a second. The B list lists threats that challenges immediate U.S. interest, but not necessarily our direct survival. Okay? And then we get the C list, which lists threats that indirectly affect U.S. national interest, but not immediate, nor are they direct. So this is a framework that we use to try to understand and try to rank, try to give some kind of priority to foreign policy issues. So let's jump in. Let's take a closer look and let's try to apply this framework, right? So let's take a look at this. So let's give a list of foreign policy issues, right? There's a lot we can choose from, right? We have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, nuclear non-proliferation, climate change, human rights violations, regional stability, trade, cybersecurity, China, North Korea, defense of the nation, right? These are all foreign policy issues. So let's bring up these lists, right? And let's talk about where they belong. Where do these issues belong? Now, of course, if we were in the classroom, right, we would be I would be asking you and prompting you to rank these, right? And I will go based upon your suggestion. So I would encourage you for a moment, maybe take a screenshot here. Use your cell phone, grab a screenshot, or write these down real fast. And let me know, where would you place Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Does it belong in the list A, which lists threats that pose a direct and immediate challenge to the U.S. survival? Does it belong in the B list, that threats that challenges our immediate interest, but not necessarily our direct survival? Or does it belong in the C list, threats that indirectly affect U.S. national interests, but that are not immediate nor direct to our survival. And what about these other issues, right? So make this list. Let me know, where would you put this? Where would you put these issues, in which list? That said, though, I'll give you some of my input real quick, right? So Russia's invasion in Ukraine, while that does not necessarily, it is not a direct threat to our survival because it's not an invasion of our borders, it is in our interest. It is a direct challenge and an immediate challenge to our interest, particularly when we talk about regional stability. Specifically when we start talking about the preservation of a democracy, especially when we put it in the context of suffering, right? That what is happening, this war, this unjust war that is going on in Ukraine from Russia's invasion, it's costing lives, it's interfering with the balance of power, and let's not forget, Ukraine is a major exporter of wheat, which is affecting food shortages worldwide. So this, you can understand, right, that this is, while it's not a direct challenge to our survival because it's not, an invasion of America, it is to our interest. Right? Nuclear non-proliferation. I would say that this is up on the list of our own survival, right? Because if we have high nuclear proliferation, in other words, that we see nations developing an exponential amount of nuclear weapons, that this threatens not only our own borders and our own security, it threatens the entire world. And if the world blows up into a nuclear holocaust, there are no nations, right? So this is definitely on our direct survival, right? Climate change. Now, an argument could be made, right, that climate change, just the threat of it, right? We can put aside whether or not we agree that it's as dangerous as we are starting to hear. But what we can't deny is the fact that if there was no more oxygen, if there were a situation where, because of the climate, Earth is inhabitable, right? That's a direct threat to not only U.S. survival, it's a direct threat to human survival, right? So we can understand that this might be on the A list, right? Violations of human rights. Some may say that the violation of human rights, this list can go, we can view this anyway. Let me back up. So human rights violations, right? We're talking about states violating the basic needs of its own people. Right? We can understand that what's happening in another nation, while horrific as it may be, it doesn't necessarily challenge our direct survival. Nor do most people put this in the list of our own interests per se. But it is indirect. It's not an immediate challenge to us. It's not a direct challenge to us. And the level of importance, really, I would rank it pretty high, right? But you can see how some may say that it belongs on the C list because it is not directly challenging us and it indirectly affects our national interests as a whole, right? Regional stability. This is critical, right? In the context of it challenges our interest. I mean, it does, right? What's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Asia, what's happening in Latin America, what's happening in Africa, right? Especially if it's violence, especially if it's conflict, this can send ripple effects into the region, which causes regional instability, which causes more war, which can cause, the list goes on and on and on. So while it's not a direct threat to our survival, right, it is an immediate interest of ours. Right? Cybersecurity, again, it challenges our direct interest, but it can also understand why if you put this under the A list, because if we get cyber attacked, if our infrastructure fails because it was attacked by a foreign nation, that's a threat to our survival, right? So I can see how maybe we put this on the A list, or even just leaving it on the B list. China. Wait, I'm so sorry. I got ahead of myself. See what I did there? Okay, so trade, right? This is an immediate interest of ours, but it's not necessarily detrimental to our survival. Is it good for us? Yes. Is it an interest of ours? Yes. But not necessarily to our own survival. Cybersecurity, on the other hand, my apologies for that confusion. Cybersecurity. This is a direct challenge to our nation. I mean, think about it, right? What I just said just a second ago, but the fact that we have that our infrastructure, if it's computerized and if it could be hacked, right? And if we have a cold snap that comes through, right? A foreign nation, a foreign actor breaking into our infrastructure and crushing it, bringing it down without firing a bullet. This can be a direct challenge to our survival, right? Anyways, China, this is on the B list. It's a direct immediate challenge to our interest, but right now, not to our survival. China depends upon our economy just as much as we depend upon theirs in the context of trade, right? North Korea, well, given the fact they have threatened to nuke us before, given the fact they have threatened to do that, North Korea belongs on the A list, right? And defense, again, without proper defenses, our survival is challenged, right? So let me know, what would you do? How would you rank these? What would you put on the A list? What would you put on the B list? And what would you put on the C list? Let me know. All right, let's move on. So actors within foreign policy. We have the white. So when I say actors, I'm not referring to, like Chris Evans or Robert Downey Jr., right? I'm not referring to those actors. I'm referring to people, institutions that act as a actor in foreign policy, right? They act in foreign policy. So, first and foremost, we have the White House. Yes, the White House. Excuse me. Constitutionally speaking, they are the dominant actor within U.S. foreign policy. They just simply are. They are, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They negotiate treaties. Official treaties, yes, they get the advice and consent of the Senate, but they originate with the president going and seeking that treaty with another nation. The president signs executive agreements with foreign nations, which does bypass that Senate. We've already spoken about that in a previous lecture. The National Security Council, the NSC, is a part of the executive branch, which is a part of the White House. They provide foreign policy options to the president. So, yeah, the dominant actor here. And the U.S. Constitution makes this abundantly clear. True, Congress has a role, and we're about to take a look at that. But just note that the dominant actor is, in fact, the president. In the U.S. Congress, they are an actor in foreign policy, and they have oversight committees, the Foreign Relations and Foreign Affairs committees. They have the power of the purse. We've already mentioned that in the previous video on exactly how powerful that can be and how that can hinder a president's foreign policy. States' approval the Senate's approval of treaties and confirmation of appointments, ambassador appointments, etc. This has the Senate plays a role. The Congress plays a role in foreign policy, and of course, remember, only the legislature can declare war. Only the U.S. Congress can declare war, and in our U.S. history, U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress has declared war officially on 11 occasions. So interesting. So, yeah, let's move on. Other actors include Intergovernmental Organizations, or IGOs. These are created by treaty to work on issues of common interest. The purpose is to create a mechanism for people to work more successfully together in the areas of peace and security. The ability to exercise power within their member countries. Right? So if we are a member of the UN, if we are a member of NATO, if we're a member of an IGO, right? And this is you can get a lot of work done towards peace, towards security, if you're part of that group, right? If you're part of the UN, because you're in the know, if you will, you're a part of the group. The ability to exercise power over that group and to bring peace and to bring security. This is the work of an IGO, and the UN, by the way, is an example of an IGO. So this is an actor in foreign policy because they are part of the international system, this environment for which we're engaging with one another. And because of that, right, they are an actor in this. Because depending upon what's going on internationally, depending upon what's happening in this environment for which we are, engaging with one another, that can play a significant role. So they are in fact an actor. And of course, last but not least, we have public opinion. You and I are actors in foreign policy. Okay. Now, remember I mentioned a moment ago that foreign policy takes the back burner? This is another example of it. This is the most recent poll I can find about, in general, our attitude towards foreign policy. So let's take a look at this poll. Right? Do you think the United States should or should not take the leading role among all other countries in the world in trying to solve international problems? And the majority said with 54%. Now that's plus or minus 3. Remember, that's either, in reality, it's either 57% or it's more close to around 51%. By the way, we're still talking about the majority here. The majority said, yeah, we shouldn't. And you may agree with that, and I can understand why. Like I mentioned earlier about how much budget we use. It is a lot. We do have issues here at home, right? We do, obviously. But we're going to take a look at what it means to be a hegemon, what the Cold War did, and we're going to be diving into a discussion. Because we just, spoiler alert, real fast, just a quick spoiler, that with great power comes great responsibility. Spider-Man, right? And that's true. We won the Cold War. Spoiler alert. We won the Cold War between the former Soviet Union, known today as Russia. We won that Cold War. And with winning that war, we obtained responsibilities as being the hegemon, as being the leader of the free world, as the dominant actor within this atmosphere for which we are engaging other nations. We're going to dive more into that in just a moment. But it's interesting, right? Because you and I, we vote, and the president, right, doesn't act alone, and we get to vote for a president every 4 years. Congress is up for election every 2 and 6 years, so we have an input. We absolutely do. And depending upon who we vote for, our will is reflected in that, right? We elect people that agree with our worldview or with our ideas of what it means to be, in this international system. I'm digressing, so let's move on. Right? So approaches in foreign policy. There are 3 we're going to talk about today. Okay, there are 3. The first here is isolationism. This idea that a state, a nation, stays out of foreign entanglements and keeps to itself. In other words, I'm not hanging out with friends. I'm literally in isolation by myself. Okay, I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to get entangled. And we may actually share that point of view. Right? We might be that. An example of this approach is the United States prior to December 7th, 1941. America didn't want to engage in the World War. We did not want to get involved in World War II. We didn't. Not after the bloodshed that we experienced in World War I. We just didn't want to get entangled. We just didn't want to do it. Nevertheless, we were pushed into it because of this Pearl Harbor. We got bombed. Homeland was attacked. And of course, Hitler declared war on the United States as well later. So, the United States prior to December 7th, 1941 is a good example of isolationism. And again, I can understand why we may hold on to that particular viewpoint, right? Because we do have a lot going on here at home. But just because we have a lot going on here doesn't mean we can't do 2 things at the same time, right? Anyways, I'm digressing. Multilateralism is the second approach, right? This is where states work in concert with other states, with other nations, right? Building that coalition. Again, we can't mention in the beginning of the lecture here that it is it's other state. You're building that coalition to address a particular issue, whatever that issue may be. Right? An example of this would be the Gulf War, the first one from 1990 to 1991. Right? President Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, built a coalition of nations that went into Kuwait, that drove Saddam out of Kuwait back straight to Baghdad, and that was it. Mission complete. We came home. Right? But we built a coalition. We got the cooperation from other nations, including states like Saudi Arabia, Europe, of course. So it's building this concert, if you will, of, pun intended, building this concert of actors of other states for a specific goal. Right? That's acting multilaterally. Unilateral, on the other hand, remember, we mentioned this, right? It's acting alone. States, nations acting alone without the consent from others. Right? So think of it like this, right? Let's say there's a situation going on in a nation that we are appalled by and that we believe we should act. And if no one wants to help us, if no one sees it as a problem, if no one is willing to, intervene, then acting unilaterally would say, okay, then we're going to do it ourselves. If you're not going to help me with this, this is important enough to warrant doing this alone. Right? That's acting unilaterally. An example of this, the Iraqi War from 2003 through 2011. So instruments of foreign policy include agreements and treaties made with other nations, foreign aid, economic sanctions, military force. But there's a lot here. So let's talk about this, right? An agreement or a treaty, right? This is a significant high-level talks with other nations, right? That bolsters them. Giving foreign aid is a critical component of foreign policy. Think of it like this, right? Can you get more with honey than you can with vinegar? Right? Can you get more with buttering someone up rather than kicking them down? Do you see what I'm saying? Foreign aid is used in a manner of we can potentially change a nation's mind by giving it foreign aid as a way to change their mind to our perspective, put them on our side, if you will. But so this is a persuasive way of getting what we want, if you will, without having to use combat or without having to use armed forces. Right? Economic sanctions, this is a tool that is used by foreign policy decision makers as a way to punish, right? We saw plenty of this discussion when Putin invaded Ukraine, right? That United States levied sanctions, economic sanctions that were designed to hurt as a punitive act against Russia. Same thing, the EU, NATO nations, Europe as a whole, they have stood up and levied these sanctions as a way to punish, punitively punish Putin for his war. And of course, military force. If we can't get, if the situation deters so much that we have to use military force, right? This is a tool that foreign policy decision makers have. I'm digressing. We've got a lot more ground to cover. So there are two types of power regarding how we use our tools that I want to have a quick discussion on. Right? The first is soft power, right? Rooted in power of attraction, persuasion, seeking to convince other nations to willingly identify with and support the United States position on whatever the issue may be or country it may be. Right? So an example, using the military for disaster and humanitarian relief efforts. Right? So soft power is trying to attract someone to our point of view in terms of other nations, trying to attract other nations to our point of view, trying to persuade them to our way of thinking. Right? Hard power, on the other hand, is using force or compelling another nation to act in a specific prescribed fashion. Right? Commonly, when we think of hard power, let's be honest. We often put this in the context of the U.S. military. Right? We often think of military force. But virtually all these instruments, right? Sanctions, military force, foreign aid. What was the other one? I'm getting too excited. All these tools, virtually all tools and instruments of foreign policy can be used in this way to compel another nation, right? Look no further, for example, than what Vice President Biden did with Ukraine. Hey, Ukraine, shape up your politics or you're not going to get, in other words, clean up your corruption. Because there was a point, the judicial branch had some corruption issues. Fix this, or you're not going to get U.S. foreign aid. Right? That's you're using hard power with that. Yeah. Right. You're compelling another nation to a prescribed fashion, and you're not using the military for it. Right? You see where I'm going with this? So, hard power is the traditional means by which states protect and advance their national interest, friend or foe. So let's dive into the international system. Okay? The international system, the definition of this is the environment for which states engage one another. Nations engage with one another. Remember, when I say states in this lecture, I'm referring to other nations or nations. So the international system is the environment for which other nations interact with one another. Right? So there are some characteristics that we need to discuss. We need to talk about. There's multipolar, bipolar, and unipolar. Multipolar is a host of influential actors within the system. Right? There are a host of other nations that are influential within this environment for which we engage with one another. The way I like to describe, the way that I use an analogy for the international system. And let's envision for 1 second, bear with me, that we're in a classroom, okay? And let's hypothetically say that we're in a class. It's a class total of 32 students and me, right? How many influential actors are there? How many influential people are in that room? Let's say that classroom is defined as the entire world, right? Well, in my opinion, I would say, we got a lot of people there. You are your own actor, if you will, right? So I would say you are influential, right? So I like to use the classroom, right? A bipolar is where two major influential actors are competing for dominance, right? We can use the classroom, right? Let's say there's one student that likes to talk a lot, right? Which I have no problems with. Let me be clear about that, right? We all learn differently, and I totally get that. I was a student that always spoke up a lot in class, so that was me. Not that I was fighting for or competing for dominance. Neither are you, if you're like that either. But the point is, though, right? Let's say you have one of the students in this hypothetical class that likes to talk a lot, and they are engaging a lot with the class and with the professor, with me. This could be described as a bipolar situation, that we have two actors. Right? Unipolar is where one nation one nation commands the influence of the international system. Often it's been my experience that most students would say that the classroom setting is a unipolar system, where there's one actor that has complete dominance of the system, and that is the professor. But again, I would say that's been my experience. It should be more multipolar. But I'm digressing. So we can take a look at these characteristics, right, and apply them to foreign policy, right? If we take a look at what the international system was like prior to World War II, definitely it would be classified as multipolar. After World War II, definitely bipolar, with the Cold War lasting for almost 50 years between the former Soviet Union, now today known as Russia, and the United States, the West versus the East. Right? At the end of the Cold War in 1990, 1991, we became a unipolar system where the United States, the West, commanded influence of the international system. And this is where I get this thought that with great power comes great responsibility. We were the victors of the Cold War. Therefore, that power, there's responsibility behind it. And should we be the police of the world? Maybe not. But if we don't, we will create a power vacuum that someone else will fill. And we may not want that someone telling us, the United States, what to do. You see where I'm going with this? I'm digressing. We got a lot more ground. So let's keep moving. So levels of analysis, right? Individual level of analysis. We've already briefly talked about this, so I might go a little bit faster. So remember that individual level of analysis, we're taking a look at the personal characteristics of individuals, because after all, individuals are the ones who make policy, right? So we're taking a look at the value system. We're taking a look at the belief system, the psychological traits for which they have, their very nature, the upbringing, their education level. We're looking at everything that makes them, right? Again, we can explain World War II by simply looking at the rhetoric and the belief system of Adolf Hitler. State level of analysis, we are looking at the form of government, right? The structure of government of another nation. What is it? What's it like? Is it a constitutional republic? Is it a republic? Is it a democracy? Is it an autocracy? Is it a theocracy? Is it an oligarch? Or an oligarchy? Is it, a totalitarian form of government? Is it authoritarian government? What system of government does it have? Does it have a strong legislature? Does it have a strong executive branch? Does it have 3 equal branches of government? Does it, all these components of its government? What is its political culture like? Even its geographical location? So all this plays into the state level of analysis. We're looking at the nation, right? Democracies behave a certain way, and it's true, right? Democracies, if they're stable, right, we know the outcomes of and how they're going to behave. Take a look at the concept within international relations, the concept that democracies don't fight. It's a theory that democracies do not fight other democracies. So if everyone was a democracy, you would see conflict very low. And we can understand we can understand that by looking at that system of government. Right? I'm digressing. Let's move on to the third level, which is the system level of analysis. The focus is on the international system, this environment for which we engage with one another. Right? The system cause and the state effect. Right? So what's going on in the international system as a whole has an impact on our output of foreign policy. So we look at the power characteristics. Is it bipolar, multipolar, unipolar? What are the relationships? What kind of alliances? What kind of defense agreements have been made? Right? The behavior of states during the Cold War. So why would the United States openly overthrow a democratically elected president of Guatemala back in the 1950s? Why would we have done that? What kind of explanation is there for that? And in short, we can explain that by looking at the system level of analysis. Again, in the 1950s, what was happening? We had the Cold War, right? Yeah, absolutely. You're right. We had the Cold War. And that was a fight, an indirect fight, indirect fight with Russia, with the East, with the former Soviet Union. And the democratically elected president of Guatemala at the time was too friendly with the idea. They were flirting with the idea of talking with the communist Russia, with the Soviet Union. That threatened our interest, right? Because if we have a nation that literally is, our next door neighbor, right? This causes a threat to us. Now, I'm not justifying anything here, right? I'm not. All I'm saying is we can explain why we engaged in that coup by looking at the system level, right? Why do we overthrow a democratically elected president? That doesn't sound like something that another democracy would do. And that's how we can understand this, is looking at the system level. Let's move on. So the Cold War, it was in fact an indirect war with the Soviet Union and the West. Right. This period was shortly after World War II, and it lasted from approximately 1945 to 1991. So yeah. Again, the Soviet Union, now today known as Russia. This can't just be I need to highlight this a little bit more, right? Let's put this in perspective. Russia, the country that Putin is the leader of, we were in an indirect war with them since from 1945 until 1991. So let's see. Let's see if we can do this real fast. 55, 65, 75, 85. Not quite 50 years. We're under 50 years here, but we were in an indirect war with them for a long time. So there is a certain level of trust issues that we have. Since Russia is still an authoritarian oligarchy, I don't know if there's compatibility between us in the context of being best friends. Right? It's not to say that we can't be one day. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying with the authoritarian oligarchy that they have right now, which violates key democratic principles for which we hold extremely dear, as we should. I don't know if there's enough compatibility right now to be best friends. One day, sure, maybe. But not right now, right? So this was the Cold War was divided between the two superpowers, and let's be clear: the former Soviet Union was a superpower during this time, and the United States. The Cold War was a fight for hegemony. What is hegemony? Hegemony, or hegemon, is the dominant actor of the international system. They are the leader of the international system. So in short, the Cold War was a fight to be the king of the hill. The Cold War was a indirect war to gain complete dominance of the international system. That's what the Cold War was about. So the importance of hegemony, right? The definition, what is a hegemon? It is the dominant power, like I said earlier, just a second ago, of the international system. There is a theory, it's called the hegemonic stability theory, which states that a hegemon is necessary to support a highly integrated world economy. So there needs to be a leader as the economy is become more integrated with the rest of the world, right? So moving on, continuing on with the Cold War, we can't talk about the Cold War without diving just a tad into George Kennan's long telegram, because his telegram created the containment doctrine that would be used throughout the entire Cold War. It set the doctrine of containment, right? So he made in his long telegram, that he wrote to DC, that he said that USSR is in fact confrontational, that Marxism expresses Russian insecurity, how the USSR will expand its power and therefore needs to be contained. The U.S. must contain the USSR and let communism fail on its own. Right? So a result of this telegram that he wrote, this letter that he wrote to D.C., was that containment dominated U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. This idea of containing them. If communism cannot spread, right, then itself, Russia, the USSR, will then just collapse on itself. And it basically did, right? We won the Cold War because we were able to outspend the Cold War. To outspend Russia, the former Soviet Union, right? But I'm digressing. The point I'm trying to get at here is George Kennan came up with the idea that if we just contained Russia, it can't spread. Think of it like a fire, right? If a fire can't get oxygen, it can't spread, it can't move, it can't grow. That's the idea here. It's containment. Another doctrine that dominated the Cold War era was MAD. M-A-D. This strategy. It's also referred, what MAD stands for is mutually assured destruction. Right? It's the idea that if each side could retaliate and assure a certain amount of destruction to the other side at each level of escalation, neither side would risk escalation. In other words, let's the way I like to describe MAD, okay, is let's say that you and I, right, are two nations. Let's say you're nation A and I'm nation B, right? And if I know you're built up and you have enough muscle that if you hit me, I am dead. If you punch me in my face, I am a dead man, right? And if you knew that I was built up enough, bulked up enough that if I hit you, you're dead as well, right? Then you and I both know and will recognize that I'm not going to attack you. I'm not going to punch you first because I don't want you to retaliate and punch me back and knock me out, right? So the idea here is that, it might be a bad analogy, but bear with me. It'll make sense in just a second. This idea that the USSR, the West, and the East, USSR, and the Soviet Republic blocs, along with the West, NATO, and the United States, we're not going to attack Russia because we know they can nuke us back. Right? It's mutually assured. If they nuke us, we will nuke them. And there will be no one standing. That's MAD. Pun intended. Right? So this also dominated, like I said, U.S. foreign policy because this idea that we have enough arms, we have enough built up military or enough built up nuclear weapons that if you dare attack us, you're not going to be standing. There will be nothing left of you. Does that make so? That's MAD. Anyways, so the Cold War came. The ending of the Cold War, it did end in 1991, right? So today, the post-Cold War era reflects a more politically free Europe and reduced threats of nuclear war and highlighted awareness of terrorist attacks. So we moved away from nuclear non-proliferation during the, I would say, the late 80s, early 90s. We moved away from that and highlighted acts of terrorism. And we saw that shift change drastically. We saw a gradual shift to terrorism throughout the mid and late 1990s, and we were building that up. But we saw this major shift in the wake of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. This changed, right? We saw this major shift quickly to terrorism, global terrorism as well. So we moved away from these wars with other nations, right, to conflicts with ideologies. And that's what terrorism basically is. It is a form of ideology. Extreme, by the way, but that's what we're looking at here, right? So the war on terrorism, this way we saw a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy apparatus. We saw the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. This changed our approach to foreign policy. I already mentioned this in a previous video, the impact 9/11 had on U.S. foreign policy. It had an effect on U.S. domestic policy. It had an impact on just our society as a whole. We saw a gradual move towards unilateralism. That is, if we can't build a coalition, if we can't convince other people to help us out, we're just going to do it on our own because we see the benefit in that. That this is a threat that even if it's not perceived by other people, we're still going to act on our own. And then we saw the development of the Bush Doctrine, this idea of preemptive striking. We're going to strike someone before they, we're going to strike them before they attack us, right? Now, to describe the Bush Doctrine, one of the things I love to do is to bring up a Marvel movie. So bear with me here, okay? Have you ever seen Captain America, the Winter Soldier? I would highly recommend going and seeing that, or watching it, or at least watch the trailer to it. Because there's this one particular scene that sums up the Bush Doctrine in a nutshell. Okay? And if you did watch it, reflect back on the time when Captain America was talking with Nick Fury, and towards the beginning of the movie, about Nick Fury made a comment, something to the effect of, we're going to be able to wipe out a lot of hostiles before they become a threat. In other words, preemptive striking. We're going to preemptively strike a target before they attack us. And Captain America responded back with, I thought the punishment came after the crime. That's an argument. Captain America's statement there is an argument against the Bush Doctrine, against this idea of preemptive striking. So, you may not have known this, but the Marvel movies are very political, especially that particular one. There are so many political themes in it. It's fascinating. I'm digressing. But the Bush Doctrine is this idea of preemptive striking. Before we get attacked, we're going to attack first. Right? So, foreign policy today, right? We have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They denied the invasion leading up to February 24, 2022. Russia denied that they were even going to invade, and yet they did. Right? Which, in the wake of invading Ukraine, this brought reunification of NATO. NATO, by the way, is short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's NATO. We are also seeing a massive refugee and humanitarian crisis developing in Ukraine. Massive amount of refugees are fleeing the nation as it is unsafe to live there. We are seeing war crimes being committed in Bucha and other portions of Ukraine. And there are accusations of this crime of genocide, that Putin is actually committing genocide in Ukraine. I can't remember, it was Finland and one other nation. I can't remember which other nation it was, so forgive me about that. But there were two European parliaments or legislative bodies that they came out and formally recognized as a government that Putin is committing genocide in Ukraine. So what I want to do now is shift our discussion from foreign policy into genocide. And what is this concept of genocide? What is it? How do we deal with it? And what is actually being said? So with that said, let's dive into concepts of genocide. So genocide is a word that was coined by Raphael Lemkin, this man right here. Long story short, genocide is a combination of Greek and Latin. Geno or genos means group or tribe, and side is Latin for killing. So in essence, genocide, by its original definition by Raphael Lemkin, is simply group killing. Okay, that's genocide by its original definition. And Raphael Lemkin, he was a international jurist who was also Jewish, and he struggled with this question of why is killing of 1 million people a lesser crime than the killing of a single individual. He struggled with this, as we all should. A long story short, during World War I, there was the Armenian Genocide. Remember that the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and modern-day Turkey today, was formed in the ashes of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Ataturk, the leader at the time, wanted to create a pure Turkish nation, and the Armenians did not fit that bill. So he murdered 1.5 Armenians. Now this happened during World War I. And Raphael Lemkin was struggling with that. And what happened was this one Armenian who was able to escape, he was in France. And this Armenian walked down the street and saw at a local cafe a Turk who was enjoying coffee or enjoying the cafe, and he recognized that Turk as the man responsible for murdering his entire family. The Armenian grabbed a gun and shot him. The Turk who murdered his entire family never saw any legal consequences. But the Armenian who shot him, he faced legal consequences. This was a struggle for Raphael Lemkin, and this set him on the journey to define genocide. So that is what is genocide. Genocide is group killing. Now, we have, through Raphael Lemkin and through his work, he pushed through the United Nations, the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Okay? And Raphael Lemkin gave us a international law definition, and we're about to take a look at that. Lemkin here, Raphael Lemkin, he had a lot of work in genocide, if you will. He later, I'm getting too far ahead of myself. Raphael Lemkin, he worked in the Nuremberg trials, the trials that we held Nazis responsible for the war crimes during World War II and for what they did to their own people and to the Jewish people. Raphael Lemkin worked with the United States on that, and that was the first time that we saw the charges of genocide levied against someone, and they were found guilty of this new crime of genocide. So let's talk about this UN convention now. Let's get back to this, because this convention was was pushed by Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin pushed the UN to adopt this convention. So the United Nations Convention on Genocide, its original draft, the UN Convention, the original drafting, included political and other groups. However, the Soviet Union, i.e. Russia, they resisted it. And the Russian the former Soviet Union allies, they resisted it. Why? Because they feared accusations of genocide themselves. We have to remember, while yes, the former Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was an ally of the United States. Yes. He was not, nor was Russia, perfect. We have to remember a conservative estimate here. Stalin killed approximately 21 million political prisoners during his reign. 21 million people. So yeah, they feared being accused of genocide because they murdered 21 million people during Stalin's reign in power. So, yeah. So they feared these. They feared accusations of genocide. So they argued for the exclusion. Now you have to remember, there are 5 permanent members at the UN. 5. China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These are the 5 members. Now what's interesting is there is actual discussion whether or not the former Soviet Union, which was the original permanent member, whether or not they should have that status or not. Because Russia always assumed it because the former Soviet Union was Russia. But there might be an actual case against it, and that there might actually be a case that actually might belong to Ukraine rather than Russia. What do you think about that, though? What do you think? Do you think that's a legitimate argument, or do you support that notion? Let me know. But anyways, going back to the convention here, right? So they obviously had the weight to push against the convention, right? So Raphael Lemkin reluctantly agreed, and he took out political and other groups from the original draft. Okay, that did in fact happen. So the definition, the international legal definition of genocide is as follows, according to the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Note the absence of political and other groups. Okay, so destroying in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. All right, so these are the protected groups that if they are targeted, and if even just a portion of them are killed, right, then this constitutes genocide. And there are, in fact, 5 crimes of genocide. So let's take a look at these, or 5 acts of genocide. Okay. Now, to be clear, genocide, you do not have to meet all 5 criteria in order to be genocide. You can just commit one of these acts, just one. Right? But the 5 acts are as follows: killing members of the group, right? Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and lastly, forcefully transferring children of the group to another group. So these are the 5 acts of genocide. And again, just to quickly recap, you do not have to commit all 5 of these in order to be genocide, in order to constitute genocide. Just one of these acts. And there are, in fact, some limitations to this convention, right? Note, again, it excludes political and social groups. This is problematic because, you can now, right, with this UN convention, if you kill a social group, well, that's not genocide, but it's by the convention, right? So this is problematic. Proving intent beyond reasonable doubt is extremely difficult. This is a downside of the convention, because proving legally beyond reasonable doubt, okay, that is hard to do. But one of the things I would like to say about accusing Putin of genocide is the fact that we see state media, Russian media, literally laying out that these people don't deserve to live, right? That they are literally discussing in the open that Ukrainians. We can just listen to what the Russian media is saying, and we get the intent. It is pretty easy to prove based upon the rhetoric the government itself is using. Remember, the media in Russia is owned, sponsored, and controlled solely by the government. It's not a free press like we have. Okay? So we can prove intent pretty easily just looking at the rhetoric for what they're saying. But UN members are hesitant to single out other members or to even intervene. And we've seen this time and time again, right? We saw this with the Cambodian genocide in the 1970s, the 1980s Guatemala genocide, the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, the 2016 genocide in of the Yazidis. We have the Uyghur genocide happening in China. We see genocide. Oh yeah, cannot forget the Darfur genocide in 2004 to present day. I mean, we have cases and cases and cases of it, and the UN just, it's reluctant, right? And finally, there is no moral or legal obligation to act in cases of genocide. When there is genocide happening, there is no moral or legal obligation. Now, true, society has done that. Remember, after the Holocaust, we said never again will we let this happen. So society has made a promise, if you will. But what we've seen, right, is that it continues to happen, and that the convention itself does not provide a legal obligation or a moral obligation. It is just one that society has said never again. And we have failed time and time and time and time again. So, we're going to bring this to an end. So, because we're done with the lecture. And let me ask you, what can we do? In the wake of the never again cry of the Holocaust, in the fact that we see these cases of genocide happening, should we intervene? Should we use our authority and power that we have? Let me know. That being said, if there's anything I've said, or if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please do not hesitate to email me. That said, we'll see you next time. Peace.